Have you ever wondered how anyone survived the Arctic winter before electricity, before insulation, before any of the comforts we take for granted when the temperature drops? Imagine a darkness that lasts for months, a cold so persistent that it seeps through stone and wood and cloth, a wind that never quite stops whispering against walls made of earth and grass. How did entire communities, families, children, the old and infirm, live through seasons when the sun barely rose, when the world outside became a white, silent void? Tonight we're traveling to a place where winter wasn't a season, but a state of being, where survival depended not on heroism, but on the quiet, endless repetition of small, careful tasks. We're stepping into a Norse village perched at the edge of the known world, where the Arctic pressed down like a heavy blanket, and where people discovered ways to hold warmth close when everything around them conspired toward cold. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early Norse settlements of the far north, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're settling in for this passage into history's cold corners, consider tapping the like button and subscribing to Epic Boring History. It helps these stories reach others who seek this kind of gentle exploration. Drop a comment too if you'd like. Let me know where you are in the world right now and what hour finds you listening. Some of you might be wrapped in the deep quiet of night, others watching dawn creep across your windows, and some suspended somewhere between waking and sleeping. Now, if you can, dim whatever lights surround you. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, constant hum that makes everything feel a little more distant. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift back more than 1,000 years to a place where warmth was not a given, but a triumph of knowledge passed quietly from one cold hand to another. Imagine yourself in the year 985 in a settlement so far north that the very concept of day and night loses meaning for half the year. You live in a place where winter doesn't arrive and then depart. It settles in and stays, a guest that overstays its welcome by months, dominating every thought, every action, every breath you take. You are not a warrior or a trader or anyone whose name will be remembered. You are a farmhand, a tenant, tied to another family's land, occupying a position that is neither slavery nor freedom, but something suspended uncomfortably between the two. Your life unfolds in a longhouse made of turf and stone, a structure half buried in the earth itself, as if the building is trying to hide from the wind. This morning, though morning is only a word here, not a reality, since the sun has not truly risen in weeks, you wake in near darkness. The only light comes from the hearth's dull glow, casting long shadows that dance and flicker across the curved walls. The air you breathe is thick, heavy with the smell of smoke that never quite escapes, mingling with the scent of wet wool, animal breath, and the sweet, sour smell of old hay. You lie on a sleeping bench along the wall, sharing your space with others who also owe their labor to this household. Nearby, separated only by a low partition, the livestock shifts and snorts, cows, goats, a few hardy sheep. Their bodies generate warmth, and though the smell is far from pleasant, you have learned to be grateful for the heat they provide. Your first sensation upon waking is cold, not the sharp, immediate cold of stepping outside, but a deep, persistent chill that has settled into your bones over the long months. Your breath mists in the dim light. You reach for your boots, which you've kept near your body during the night, in a futile attempt to keep them from freezing stiff. The boots are made of thick felt, layered and compressed, designed to insulate against snow and ice. Still, as you pull them on, you feel their coldness seep through your woolen socks. Your fingers fumble with the leather ties, stiff and resistant in the frigid air. Standing requires effort. Your muscles are tight from sleep, from yesterday's labor, from the constant tension of living in cold that never releases its grip. You pull on your outer layers, more wool, always wool, the miracle fabric that insulates even when damp. Around you, others are rising too, moving slowly in the half-light. The matriarch of the household is already awake, tending the hearth, adding small pieces of precious fuel to keep the fire alive. She does not speak, and neither do you. The doorway is covered with thick hides, layered one upon another to keep out the wind. When you push through them to step outside, the cold hits you like a physical force. It's not violent or dramatic, it's simply there, absolute and uncompromising. Outside, the world has been reduced to shades of grey and white. Snow covers everything in smooth, deceptive curves that hide rocks and holes and the actual shape of the ground. The wind is steady, not howling, but persistent, carrying tiny ice crystals that sting any exposed skin. Your first task is to check the roof. Snow accumulates constantly, and if too much builds up, the weight can collapse the turf and timber structure. You climb carefully, your feet sinking into the soft snow that covers the roof's thick turf walls. Using a wooden shovel, you push the snow off in heavy chunks. The work warms you slightly, though your face goes numb within minutes. Ice crystals form on your eyebrows and in your beard if you have one, or on the edge of the hood that frames your face. After the roof, you move to the water source. The household maintains several large containers outside, but in this cold, they freeze solid overnight. You must break the ice with a heavy stone, creating a hole large enough to draw water for the day's needs. The ice is thick, several inches deep, and your hands ache from the impact as you strike it again and again. When the hole finally opens, you can see the dark water below, and you dip in a wooden bucket, drawing up water so cold it seems to burn. Next come the animals. Though most of the livestock lives inside the longhouse, some supplies are kept in small outbuildings, shelters for tools, storage for dried fish, sealed containers of butter, and preserved meats. You must check each one, ensure that doors haven't blown open, that snow hasn't drifted inside through cracks. The animal troughs inside the longhouse have also frozen overnight. You use your hands to break the thinner ice forming on the surface, wincing at the sharp cold. The cows watch you with patient, incurious eyes. By now, perhaps 2 hours have passed since you woke, though time feels meaningless in the unchanging dimness. Your fingers are stiff, your face numb, and yet there is so much more to do. Inside, you join others at the morning meal, a thin porridge made from stored grain, mixed with a little dried fish for flavor. There is no abundance here, no excess. Every bite is calculated, rationed against the long months still ahead. The porridge is warm and you cup your hands around the wooden bowl, absorbing the heat. Conversation is minimal, everyone is tired, conserving energy, moving through the rhythms of another day that looks exactly like yesterday and will look exactly like tomorrow. After eating, you settle into indoor work. Today, you're repairing fishing nets, a task that requires patience and finger dexterity you no longer possess. Your hands are rough and cracked from cold and work, the fingertips numb and clumsy. You sit near the hearth, close enough to benefit from its warmth, but not so close as to offend those of higher status in the household. The firelight is dim, barely enough to see by, and you must hold the net close to your face to spot the broken strands. Hours pass in silence. Outside, the wind continues its endless monologue. Inside, there are small sounds, someone coughing, the scrape of a knife against wood, an animal shifting position, the crack and pop of the fire. Your back begins to ache from sitting. Your eyes strain in the poor light. Your mind wanders, but there is nowhere pleasant for it to go, only the cold outside, the cold still ahead, the many tasks left undone. At midday, or what passes for midday, in the endless twilight, you take another small meal. More grain, a sliver of dried meat, some bitter herb tea that has been stretched thin through many reuses of the same leaves. You're always hungry, but you've learned to live with that hollow feeling. In the afternoon, you help repair part of the turf wall where wind has found a gap. Working with frozen turf is miserable. It's heavy, difficult to shape, and your fingers go numb within minutes of touching it. But the work must be done because even a small gap can let in wind that will steal precious warmth. You pack the turf blocks tightly, pressing them into place, sealing cracks with moss that you gathered months ago before the frost made such collection impossible. The moss is frozen too, brittle and difficult to work with, but it expands slightly when it thaws, creating a better seal. As you work, you notice frost forming on the inside walls of the longhouse in the places farthest from the hearth. This is normal expected. The cold outside is so intense that it penetrates even these thick walls, condensing moisture from the air into delicate ice crystals. Evening arrives, though you can only tell by the household's routine, not by any change in the light outside. Everyone gathers for the main meal, a stew made from dried fish, some turnips from the underground storage pit, and barley. It's flavored with herbs and a tiny amount of seal fat, which makes it taste rich, even though there's very little of anything. The stew is hot, and you eat slowly, savoring each bite not just for the flavor, but for the warmth it spreads through your chest and stomach. This is one of the day's few pleasures, this moment of relative comfort, relative fullness. After the meal, there is a brief period of something almost like leisure. Someone tells an old story, speaking quietly, the words worn smooth from countless repetitions. The children, bundled in layers of wool, sit close together near the fire, their eyes heavy with sleep. You use this time to check your clothing, looking for tears that need mending, places where the fabric has worn thin. Everything wears out faster in this climate, the constant friction of movement, the way cold makes materials brittle, the endless cycle of getting wet and drying by the fire. Your fingers work a bone needle through thick wool, making small, careful stitches. The work is meditative, repetitive, and you find your mind going quiet, focused only on the small task before you. Outside, you hear the wind picking up. It's been relatively calm today, but now you can hear it beginning to howl around the corners of the longhouse, testing the structure, looking for any weakness. Inside, the animals are restless, sensing the changing weather. The cows shift and low softly, the goats bleat. Their presence is reassuring. As long as they're calm, you know the building is holding against the storm. The matriarch adds more fuel to the fire, carefully rationing the precious wood and peat. Every piece of fuel represents labor, the work of gathering, drying, storing. Nothing is wasted, nothing burned carelessly. As the night deepens, or what you call night, though the darkness is no different from the day's dimness, people begin to settle into their sleeping places. The household grows quiet except for the fire's whisper, the wind's constant voice, and the breathing of animals and people alike. You lie down on your bench, pulling the rough wool blankets over yourself. They smell of smoke and sheep and human sweat, but they're warm, and that's all that matters. Beneath you, the wooden planks are hard, but you've long since stopped noticing. Your last thoughts before sleep are not dramatic or profound. You think about tomorrow's tasks, more repairs, more animal care, more careful rationing of food and fuel. You think about the cold, always the cold, and the distant, almost mythical concept of summer. But there's also something else, something you rarely put into words. There's a strange pride in this survival, a quiet satisfaction in making it through another day, in keeping the household functioning, in maintaining the fragile balance between warmth and cold, life and death. The turf walls hold, the fire continues to glow. The animals breathe steadily, their warmth radiating through the space. Outside, the Arctic winter presses down with all its weight, but here, in this earth-sheltered refuge, life persists. You understand, in a way that goes deeper than thought, that survival here is not about individual strength or heroism. It's about the collective effort, the shared labor, the knowledge passed down through generations about how to live in a place that seems designed to kill you. Every piece of the longhouse design serves a purpose. The thick turf walls, dug partly into the earth, use the ground's insulation. The low profile reduces wind resistance. The central placement of the hearth radiates heat evenly. The inclusion of animals provides both warmth and a food source that maintains itself. Even the social structure serves survival. The hierarchy might seem harsh. You are bound to this household, obligated to work without the freedom to leave. But in return, you have shelter, food, protection. In a climate this extreme, solitude means death. The days blend together in an endless rhythm. Wake in darkness, work in dimness, sleep in darkness again. Your body aches constantly, from cold, from labor, from the poor diet and lack of sunlight. Yet you adapt. Your hands, once soft, are now calloused and rough. Your face, exposed to wind and cold, is weathered beyond your years. Your body has grown lean, efficient, burning every calorie toward the single purpose of staying warm. There are small tricks you've learned, techniques passed down or discovered through painful trial. You know to keep your clothing loose rather than tight because trapped air insulates better than compressed fabric. You know to breathe through cloth when the cold is most intense to warm the air before it reaches your lungs. You've learned which foods provide the most lasting warmth: fatty fish, seal meat when available, thick porridges that burn slowly in your stomach. You've learned to move deliberately, conserving energy, never rushing because sweat in this cold can kill. The household's daily routine has been refined over generations into a precise system of survival. Morning tasks follow a specific order: roof, water, animals, food, repairs. Each person knows their role, performs it without being told, because any confusion or delay could have consequences. The communal fire is the household's heart, quite literally. It is never allowed to die completely because relighting it in this cold would be nearly impossible. Someone is always responsible for feeding it, maintaining it, ensuring its survival, which is the household's survival. The smoke from the fire rises to the roof, where carefully placed vents allow it to escape while minimizing heat loss. But smoke still fills the upper portion of the longhouse, creating a hazy layer that you've learned to live beneath, spending your time in the clearer air near the floor. Your eyes water constantly from the smoke. Your lungs have adapted, though you've developed a persistent cough that everyone shares, a raspy sound that echoes through the building at night. Illness is a constant concern. In such close quarters, any sickness spreads quickly through the household. You've seen people weaken over the winter, their coughs becoming deeper, their bodies growing frailer. Some don't survive until spring, but you try not to think about that. Instead, you focus on the small moments of relative comfort, the warmth of the fire after hours of cold work, the taste of hot food, the feeling of finally lying down after a day of labor. There is also, strangely, a sense of peace in this life. The rhythm is predictable. Your responsibilities are clear. There are no complex decisions to make, no uncertainty about what tomorrow will bring. It will bring more cold, more work, more careful survival. The animals provide a kind of companionship, even though you know their ultimate purpose. You develop fondness for specific cows, recognize individual goats by their behavior. Their presence makes the longhouse feel less empty, less isolated. At night, when you can't sleep, you listen to the sounds of the household: rhythmic breathing, occasional snores, the shuffle of an animal shifting position, the ever-present whisper of wind outside. These sounds become a lullaby, familiar and oddly comforting. You dream sometimes of summer, though the memory grows dimmer each year. You dream of warm sun on your skin, of fresh green growing things, of water that flows instead of freezing solid. but these dreams feel almost unreal, like stories told about a distant land you've never visited. The reality is winter has always been winter, will always be winter. The brief summer months seem like an anomaly, a strange fever dream interruption in the true state of the world, which is cold and dark and silent. Yet the village survives. Children are born even in winter, arriving into this harsh world with startling resilience. The old continue living far longer than seems possible. The community endures year after year, generation after generation. This endurance is built on knowledge, practical, tested, refined through centuries of Arctic living. The placement of every stone in the hearth, the angle of every roof beam, the thickness of every turf wall represents accumulated wisdom. You are a small part of this larger organism, this community that functions like a single body, maintaining its warmth against the cold. Your individual comfort matters less than the collective survival. Your personal desires are subordinate to the needs of the household. This might sound oppressive, and in some ways it is. You have little freedom, little choice about how to spend your days. But there is also security in this. You will be fed, sheltered, protected, as long as you fulfill your role. As another day ends, and you prepare once more for sleep, you notice that the cold inside the longhouse has decreased slightly. The animals' bodies, the day's fire, the human warmth, all of these have combined to raise the temperature a few precious degrees. It's still cold by any reasonable standard, your breath still mists, the edges of the building are still thick with frost. But there is a difference, a subtle improvement that your body registers with relief. Tomorrow will be the same as today. You will wake cold, work cold, eat your rationed meals, repair what needs repairing, and survive. The day after tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that. But eventually, in some distant future that's hard to imagine now, the sun will return, the snow will begin to melt, the ice will crack and flow, summer will arrive, brief and intense, and you will remember what warmth truly feels like. Until then, you endure, you work, you survive. And in that survival, in that quiet, unglamorous persistence, there is a kind of triumph that needs no witnesses, no celebration, no recognition beyond the simple fact of still being alive when the next cold morning comes. Let us now drift from the daily struggle of anonymous survival to consider one particular life, one woman whose name has come down to us through the sagas, though distorted by the storyteller's love of drama. Her name was Freydís Eiríksdóttir, and she was born into cold. Her father was Erik the Red, the man who named Greenland in what must have been either optimism or irony, claiming to have found green lands at the edge of the known world. But Freydís grew up knowing the truth, that Greenland was white more than green, that winter ruled most of the year, and that survival required not boldness but careful, endless attention to detail. She was born around the year 970 in a settlement much like the one we've just explored. Her earliest memories would have been of turf walls, smoky air, the sound of wind, and the warmth of animals sleeping nearby. She learned, as all children did, that cold was not an enemy to be fought, but a condition to be managed. The very first lesson of her childhood was simply how to exist in spaces where frost formed on the inside of walls, where breath hung visible in the air, even indoors where the body's heat had to be jealously guarded and carefully distributed. As a girl, she would have worked alongside the women of the household, learning the intricate knowledge that kept families alive through Arctic winters. This was not simple or unskilled labor. It was a complex body of expertise, passed from mother to daughter, from elder to younger, refined over generations. She learned about fire management, which was nearly an art form. She learned exactly how much fuel to use, how to bank a fire so it would last through the night without consuming excessive wood, how to read smoke patterns to adjust ventilation. This knowledge could mean the difference between a household that survived winter and one that didn't. A fire allowed to burn too hot wasted precious fuel that might be needed in the deepest part of winter when venturing out to gather more was impossible. She learned to recognize the different qualities of peat, how some burned faster and hotter, while others smoldered slowly through long nights. She learned which driftwood was best for cooking versus heating, how to stack fuel for drying, how to protect it from moisture that would make it smoke and sputter. She learned about food preservation in all its variations, which fish dried best, how to pack butter in birch bark containers so it wouldn't spoil, how to store grain in underground pits where the permafrost became an ally rather than an enemy. She learned to identify when food was beginning to turn, when to use something before it became dangerous. The subtle discoloration of dried meat, the faint smell that indicated butter had gone rancid, the texture of grain that had absorbed too much moisture. These signs had to be read correctly because a household's survival through winter depended on the quality of its preserved stores. She learned the rhythms of fermentation, how to make skyer that would keep for months, how to prepare fish in ways that transform decay into preservation rather than poison. She learned that some foods actually improved with age and careful management, developing flavors and textures that fresh ingredients lacked. She learned about clothing, about the properties of different wools, about how to layer garments for maximum warmth with minimum weight. She learned to card and spin wool with numb fingers, to weave fabric tight enough to resist wind, to sew with bone needles until her hands ached. The creation of winter clothing was a year-round occupation, not something that could be rushed when cold weather arrived. Each garment required hours of work. The wool had to be cleaned, carded until the fibers aligned, spun into thread of the correct thickness, woven into fabric, and finally cut and sewn into useful shapes. She learned which sheep produced the best wool for different purposes. Some had longer fibers, better for outer garments. Others produced softer wool suitable for layers against the skin. She learned to blend different wools to achieve particular properties, to add animal fats to make fabric more water-resistant, to repair garments so they would last multiple seasons. But she also learned something less tangible, a psychological resilience, a capacity to endure monotony and discomfort without complaint, without expectation that things would be different. She learned to find satisfaction in small improvements, small comforts, rather than yearning for dramatic change. This mental discipline was perhaps the most crucial survival skill of all. The ability to wake each morning in the dark, cold, and begin the same tasks performed yesterday and the day before, to accept that this was simply the texture of existence, that comfort and ease were temporary aberrations rather than natural states. She learned to measure time not by dramatic events but by subtle shifts. The angle of winter sun through smoke holes, the changing behavior of livestock as seasons turned, the gradual shortening and lengthening of days. She learned to find interest in small variations, to notice when the wind shifted direction, when the quality of snow changed, when animals began their seasonal transformations. The sagas would later paint her as fierce and violent, but these qualities, if she had them, emerged from something more fundamental. A deep understanding that survival required decisiveness, that hesitation in matters of household management could have fatal consequences. Every decision about resource allocation had moral weight in a place where miscalculation meant death. As she grew older, her responsibilities increased. She began to manage portions of the household herself, overseeing younger women and children, making decisions about resource allocation. She developed a reputation for competence, for having good judgment about when to ration more strictly, when to take risks. Other women in the settlement began to consult her about difficult decisions, whether to slaughter an animal that seemed weak, whether stores of a particular food would last until spring, whether it was safe to reduce daily rations or better to maintain them and accept that reserves might run short. Her father's fame as an explorer gave her family status, but status in Greenland didn't mean luxury. It meant slightly better access to resources, slightly more political influence, but still the same grinding daily work against the same relentless cold. Erik's household had more livestock than some neighbors, better grazing land, perhaps an extra room in the longhouse, but these advantages simply meant more animals to manage, more space to heat, more responsibility. The weight of her father's reputation also meant expectations. People looked to Erik's household to demonstrate competence, to set standards for how things should be done, to provide leadership during community crises. She married, though the details are unclear. Her husband's name was Thorvard, and he seems to have been a practical match rather than a romantic one, a partnership formed to combine resources and labor, to create a stronger household unit in a place where weakness could be fatal. The marriage would have been negotiated carefully with attention to what each party brought to the union. Thorvard presumably contributed labor, perhaps some property or livestock, connections to other families that could be valuable during difficult seasons. Together they managed a farmstead in Greenland, raising animals, preserving food, surviving winters that seemed endless. She bore children, though the sagas don't tell us much about them, and in that silence we can imagine both joy and sorrow, the happiness of new life, the grief of children lost to illness or accident. The process of bearing and raising children in such an environment required its own set of survival skills. Pregnant women still had to work through most of their term, still had to manage heavy tasks and exposure to cold, still had to maintain the household, even as their bodies changed. Birth itself was dangerous, handled by experienced women using knowledge passed down through generations. The mother-to-be would have been attended by women who had seen many births, who knew how to position her body, when to apply pressure, how to manage bleeding, when to be worried, and when to be patient. And then came the challenge of keeping infants alive through Arctic winters. Babies needed constant warmth, frequent feeding, protection from the smoke and cold that permeated every dwelling. She would have learned to sleep lightly, waking at every sound from the infant, monitoring breathing and temperature constantly. She would have learned to nurse even when exhausted, to wrap the child in the softest wool, to keep the baby close to her body for warmth during the coldest nights. The loss of children was common enough that every mother carried the possibility of it always. Illness could strike suddenly, or accidents could happen in moments of inattention, a child wandering too close to the fire, or out into deadly cold, or falling from some height. Each loss carved itself into a mother's heart, but survival required continuing forward. Other children still needed care, the household still needed management, grief had to be folded into the ongoing work of staying alive. Her life might have continued in this pattern indefinitely, bound to the rhythms of Arctic farming, had it not been for news from the West. Her brother Leif had voyaged to lands even further beyond the known world, returning with tales of milder climates, of forests full of timber, of rivers thick with salmon. These tales must have seemed like dreams to the Greenlanders, who lived in a place where trees were scarce and valuable, where wood was hoarded and used sparingly. The idea of a land with forests stretching endlessly must have been almost impossible to imagine. In Greenland, every piece of wood had a known history and designated purpose. Driftwood that washed ashore was carefully collected and stored. Timber imported from Norway at great expense was used only for the most crucial structural elements. Even small branches were saved for kindling. To hear of a place where trees grew so thickly that you could cut them without worry, where timber was available simply for the taking, this must have seemed like a vision of paradise to people who understood the value of wood in their very bones. Every roof beam, every ship's plank, every tool handle represented precious material that had to be preserved and maintained for years. When another expedition was planned to these western lands, to Vinland, as Leif had named it, Freydís decided to join. This decision requires us to pause and consider what it meant, leaving behind everything familiar, everything carefully prepared for survival, to voyage into unknown seas. She would have had to abandon her household's winter preparations, the work of an entire summer spent gathering and preserving. She would have to trust others to manage her farmstead, to care for livestock, to maintain the structures she had worked so hard to establish. The preparation for such a journey would have taken months, perhaps a full year. Every aspect required planning. The ship needed repairs and maintenance, provisions had to be accumulated and packed, and crew members had to be recruited and organized. Ships were delicate instruments requiring constant maintenance to remain seaworthy. Every plank had to be examined for rot or damage, every joint had to be sealed with tar and wool, every rope and sail had to be checked for weakness. The accumulation of provisions presented its own challenges. Enough food had to be gathered to sustain the crew during the voyage and the initial period in Vinland before they could establish their own food production. This meant dried fish in enormous quantities, dried meat, hard bread that would keep for months, butter and cheese, dried berries, whatever could be preserved and packed efficiently. Each item had to be protected from moisture, from rats, from the constant movement and spray of ocean travel. Freydís threw herself into this preparation with the same methodical competence she'd developed managing her household. She understood that success in Vinland would depend not on warrior skills, but on the same practical knowledge that kept people alive in Greenland, the ability to build shelter, preserve food, maintain warmth, and manage communal resources. She likely took charge of organizing the expedition's domestic supplies, determining what tools would be needed for food preparation, what equipment for textile production, what materials for building shelters. These decisions drew directly on her years of household management, translating that knowledge to the different context of exploration. The voyage itself, when it finally came, was an ordeal of a different kind than winter cold. Days and nights merged into a rhythm of rowing, sailing, bailing water, and trying to rest in cramped, wet conditions. The ship moved through waters that ranged from glassy calm to violently rough. During storms, waves broke over the sides, drenching everyone and everything, requiring constant bailing to keep the vessel from becoming waterlogged. Freydís would have felt the spray of cold seawater, tasted salt on her lips, felt her body ache from the constant motion of the ship. She would have watched the horizon, searching for the landmarks Leif had described, knowing that navigation errors could send them hopelessly off course into endless ocean. Sleep came in brief, uncomfortable intervals. The ship was too small for everyone to lie down simultaneously, so people slept in shifts, wedged between cargo, never quite dry, never quite warm. Food was monotonous and difficult to prepare in the ship's confined space. Dried fish, gnawed directly, hard bread softened with water, occasional hot meals cooked over carefully managed fires in protected containers. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully, as supplies were limited and spoilage was always a risk. The psychological challenge of ocean crossing was perhaps greater than the physical one. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no landmarks, no sense of progress, just the eternal motion of waves. Days blurred together until it seemed they had always been at sea, would always be at sea. The mind had to be disciplined against despair, against the fear that they had sailed too far west or north or south, that they would never find land again. But eventually, after weeks at sea, the coast of Vinland emerged from the morning mist. Trees, more trees than any Greenlander was accustomed to seeing, covered the shore. The air smelled different, felt different, carried a warmth that seemed almost impossible. After so long surrounded by nothing but water, the sight of land must have produced overwhelming relief mixed with exhaustion. The expedition made landfall and began establishing a settlement. Here, Freydís's expertise became crucial. She knew how to organize labor, how to prioritize tasks, how to build structures that would shelter them through winter, even though winter here would be milder than anything she'd known. The first tasks were immediate and urgent: secure the ship, establish a source of fresh water, begin building shelter before nightfall. Then came the longer-term work of creating structures substantial enough to last through the coming seasons. She would have directed the construction of turf-walled buildings similar to those in Greenland, working with materials that were similar but not quite the same. The soil here was different, the vegetation different, requiring adjustments to techniques she had known all her life. The abundance of timber was astonishing. Trees could be cut for structural beams without the careful rationing necessary in Greenland, could be used almost lavishly for fuel and building. Yet this abundance brought its own challenges. The settlers had to learn which woods were best for different purposes, which burned cleanly and which produced excessive smoke, which resisted rot and which decayed quickly. But the expedition was not alone in Vinland. The sagas tell us there were other Norse groups present, and tensions developed. Tensions over resources, over leadership, over the thousand small grievances that arise when people live in close quarters under stress. Multiple groups competing in the same territory created inevitable conflicts. Who had rights to particular fishing grounds, to stands of timber, to the best agricultural land? The sagas describe a violent confrontation, painting Freydís as ruthless, even monstrous. They claim she ordered the deaths of rival explorers, that she participated in killings herself, that she showed no remorse. We should be cautious about accepting these accounts at face value. The saga writers had their own purposes, their own narrative needs. They often exaggerated female characters in particular, making them either impossibly virtuous or dramatically violent, rarely allowing them the complexity of real human motivation. A woman who wielded authority made saga writers uncomfortable, so they transformed her into a figure of horror that better fit their narrative expectations. What likely happened was far less dramatic, but perhaps more illuminating about Freydís's character. There was probably conflict, yes, disputes about resource allocation, about leadership, about who had rights to what. In such disputes, Freydís likely took a hard line, making decisions that she believed necessary for her group's survival. She had spent her entire life learning that resources must be managed carefully, that disorder could lead to death, that someone had to make difficult choices and enforce them. In Greenland, she had learned that resources must be carefully managed, that waste or disorder could lead to death. She may have applied this same ruthless practicality to the Vinland situation, making choices that seemed harsh, but which, from her perspective, were simply necessary. When two groups both needed the same resources, when compromise seemed impossible, someone had to assert authority and make final decisions. Freydís, trained in household management where her word was law, may have simply extended that authority to the larger context of the settlement. We should also consider the strangeness of the situation these explorers faced. They were thousands of miles from home, in unfamiliar territory, without any external authority or support. The normal social structures that govern behavior in Greenland didn't fully apply. There was no chieftain to appeal to, no assembly where disputes could be formally resolved, no established customs for settling conflicts between competing groups. In such circumstances, someone with Freydís's competence and decisiveness would naturally assume authority. She wasn't acting out of cruelty or madness, but from a lifetime of training in how to manage survival situations, how to make hard choices without sentimentality. Her decisions may have seemed brutal to others, but from her perspective they were simply practical. In a place where survival was uncertain, where supply lines to home were non-existent, waste and conflict were luxuries that couldn't be afforded. The saga accounts of violence may reflect real events, but filtered through layers of interpretation and bias. Perhaps there were deaths, perhaps she ordered them, but the saga writers transformed these events into something more lurid, more dramatic, more suitable for entertaining an audience that expected stories of violence and betrayal. Eventually, the Vinland settlement failed, not because of violence, but because of the same practical factors that made all colonial ventures difficult. The settlers couldn't establish sustainable supply lines, couldn't develop productive relationships with indigenous peoples, couldn't quite adapt to the different climate and resources. The distance from Greenland was simply too great for regular resupply. Ships that made the voyage successfully one year might be lost the next, and the settlement couldn't become self-sufficient quickly enough to survive without outside support. Freydís returned to Greenland, carrying with her experiences that no one else in the settlement could fully understand. She had seen lands beyond the ice, had commanded an expedition, had faced challenges that tested her in new ways. The return voyage would have been another ordeal of weeks at sea, but now accompanied by the knowledge of failure, by questions about what could have been done differently, by the weight of decisions made under pressure. She would have had long hours to reflect on the Vinland experience, to consider whether her choices had been correct, or whether some different approach might have succeeded. Back in Greenland, her life resumed its former patterns. She returned to managing her household, to the familiar rhythms of Arctic survival. She had children to raise, animals to tend, the same endless cycle of preservation and rationing and repair. The daily work continued regardless of what she had experienced, regardless of what she had seen. But she was changed, perhaps. She had proven herself capable of leadership in extreme circumstances. She had demonstrated that the same competence that managed a household could manage an expedition. She had shown that the skills needed to survive Arctic winter, careful planning, decisive action, emotional control, were exactly the skills needed for exploration. The sagas hint that she faced some social consequences for her actions in Vinland, that her reputation suffered. But she endured this too with the same stoic persistence she brought to everything else. She survived the gossip, the judgment, the stain on her name. People talked, speculated about what had really happened in Vinland, perhaps avoided her, or treated her with a mixture of respect and unease. She grew older in Greenland, watching her children grow, seeing new generations born into the same cold world she had known. She continued to manage her household with skill and efficiency, her authority based on demonstrated competence rather than affection. Her body aged as all bodies do, joints stiffening from years of labor, hands becoming gnarled from decades of work in cold water and colder air. But the knowledge she carried remained sharp, refined by experience into something approaching mastery. She trained younger women in the same skills she had learned as a girl, passing on the accumulated wisdom of generations. She taught them to read smoke patterns, to judge the quality of preserved food, to make decisions about resource allocation. Some of these students became skilled managers in their own right, carrying forward the traditions that kept households alive through Arctic winters. Others learned the basics but never quite developed the intuition that separated adequate householders from excellent ones. We don't know exactly when or how she died. The sagas lose interest in her after the Vinland incident, moving on to other dramatic tales. She probably died in her bed, in a turf-walled longhouse not unlike the one she was born in, surrounded by family and the ever-present smell of smoke. Her death would have been attended by women who had learned from her, who had benefited from her guidance, who understood what she had accomplished, even if the larger world had forgotten. Her legacy is complex. The sagas remember her as violent, but this may be less about her actual character and more about the saga writer's discomfort with a woman who wielded authority decisively. They made her monstrous because they couldn't quite process a woman who acted with the same harsh pragmatism expected of men. A male leader making similar decisions would have been praised for strength and resolution, but a woman doing the same became a figure of horror in the telling. A more nuanced view sees her as someone shaped by her environment, by the demands of Arctic survival. She learned young that sentimentality was a luxury that could cost lives, that resources must be carefully guarded, that order must be maintained through firm leadership. These qualities served her household well through countless winters. They served her expedition in Vinland, even if the sagas portray the outcome negatively. They were not failings, but survival adaptations, developed over a lifetime of facing conditions that killed the unprepared. In a gentler climate with more abundant resources, perhaps she would have been different, but we can only know the person her environment created. In this way, Freydís represents something important about Norse Arctic settlement, the fact that women's knowledge and leadership were crucial to survival, even if the saga writers preferred to focus on male warriors and explorers. The management of warmth, food, and household order was not peripheral to Norse success in the Arctic. It was central. Without women who could preserve food through winter, manage fires efficiently, create adequate clothing, and train the next generation in these skills, no amount of warrior prowess or exploration would have mattered. The settlements would simply have failed, their inhabitants dying of cold and starvation despite any military victories. Her life spanned the full range of what was possible for a Norse woman in that era and place. She experienced the grinding daily survival of Arctic farming, the adventure and danger of overseas exploration, the exercise of authority in extreme circumstances, and the long, quiet decline into old age in a harsh land. She saw more of the world than most people of her time, traveled farther, faced greater challenges. Yet she also experienced the same universal human moments, the joy of children, the grief of loss, the satisfaction of work well done, the slow accumulation of experience that becomes wisdom. If we could speak with her, she might be puzzled by our interest. From her perspective, she simply did what needed to be done, made the choices that seemed necessary, survived as her mother and grandmother had survived. She might not see herself as remarkable at all, might consider her life ordinary, defined more by daily routines than by dramatic moments. The Vinland voyage might seem, in retrospect, like a brief interruption in the larger pattern of her existence rather than its defining episode. But from our distance we can appreciate what her life represents, the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, the adaptability of human beings to environments that seem impossibly hostile, the way that practical knowledge becomes a kind of heroism. She possessed no supernatural powers, no divine favor, just accumulated skill and determination applied consistently over decades. She was born into cold, lived in cold, died in cold. But she managed that cold with skill and determination, keeping herself and her household alive through decades of Arctic winters. In that quiet persistence, in that unglamorous competence, there is something worth remembering. The saga writers wanted stories of violence and drama, but the real story of Norse Arctic survival was humbler and perhaps more impressive, the story of people who simply refused to give up, who faced each day's challenges with practical competence, who passed their knowledge to the next generation despite knowing that the struggle would never end. Freydís's life reminds us that survival itself can be a kind of achievement. In climates that tested human limits, in places where winter could kill through a single mistake, simply staying alive required extraordinary effort disguised as ordinary routine. Every meal preserved, every garment sewn, every fire tended through a long night was an act of resistance against an environment that would have preferred human absence. The Arctic did not want them there, did not accommodate their presence, yet they persisted anyway. And in that persistence we can see something essential about the human species, our stubborn refusal to accept limits, our capacity to adapt to conditions that seem impossible, our ability to create knowledge and culture even in the least promising circumstances. Freydís and her contemporaries proved that humans could live in the Arctic, not just temporarily, but across generations, could raise families and maintain communities at the edge of the habitable world. Her story, stripped of saga embellishments, is ultimately one of competence rewarded and knowledge accumulated. She learned the skills necessary for survival, applied them consistently, earned authority through demonstrated ability, and passed her knowledge forward. That she became entangled in the dramatic events of the Vinland expedition does not define her, though it may have been the only reason her name survived in the written record. The sagas needed dramatic stories, and she provided one, but the bulk of her life was lived in the undramatic but essential work of Arctic household management. In the end, perhaps what matters most about Freydís is not whether the saga accounts of violence are accurate, but what her life reveals about women's roles in Norse Arctic settlement. She exercised real authority, made consequential decisions, possessed expertise that her community valued and needed. She was neither a passive victim nor a simple villain, but a complex person navigating difficult circumstances with the tools her culture and experience provided. In that complexity, in that refusal to fit neat narrative categories, she becomes more interesting and more human than the saga's simplified version could ever be. She lived, she worked, she survived, she died. In between those fundamental facts stretched decades of effort, skill, and endurance that made Norse Arctic settlement possible, that allowed a foothold in one of Earth's most challenging environments, that demonstrated the remarkable breadth of human adaptability. And if her name comes down to us primarily through stories that may not fully capture who she was, we can at least recognize the outlines of a remarkable life. Ordinary in its daily details, but extraordinary in its accumulated achievement, shaped by cold, but never quite defeated by it, anonymous in most of its moments, but preserved in history's occasional glimpses, ultimately unknowable, but endlessly worth contemplating. Let us drift now from individual lives into the realm of mystery, into the questions that archaeologists still puzzle over when they excavate the remains of Norse Arctic settlements. There is a mystery in the ruins, a question whispered by the placement of stones and the traces of ancient fires. The question is simple: how did they stay so warm? When archaeologists first began excavating Norse longhouses in Greenland and Arctic Norway, they expected to find evidence of desperate, barely adequate shelters, structures that kept people merely alive through winter, but not comfortable. What they found instead was evidence of sophisticated thermal management that seems, even now, more effective than it should be. Some longhouses show signs of maintaining temperatures warm enough to dry fish indoors during deep winter. Others have floor plans that suggest heat distribution far more even than a simple central hearth should provide. The buildings shouldn't have been this efficient, yet somehow they were. Modern thermal engineers examining the archaeological evidence with computer models and thermal imaging data from reconstructions find themselves surprised by performance characteristics that exceed their initial predictions. We know some of the techniques the Norse used. The turf construction itself was brilliant, layers of earth and grass creating thick walls with natural insulation, sometimes 2 or 3 feet deep. The organic material trapped air, which is an excellent insulator, while the mass of earth absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. This wasn't crude construction, but rather engineered architecture, where each layer served multiple functions simultaneously. The longhouses were often built partially underground or nestled into hillsides, using the earth itself as insulation. Permafrost in the Arctic stays at a constant cold temperature, but it's warmer than the air above it in winter, so being surrounded by earth actually helps maintain relatively higher temperatures. The central hearth was positioned with care. its placement calculated to radiate heat evenly throughout the long, narrow building. The stones around the hearth were selected for their thermal properties, their ability to absorb heat and release it slowly, acting like a thermal battery. Smoke vents were angled precisely, allowing smoke to escape while minimizing heat loss. The Norse understood somehow that hot air rises and that vents placed at the highest point of the roof would draw smoke upward while allowing heavier, warmer air to remain at living level. The animals living inside weren't just food sources, they were biological heaters. A single cow generates significant warmth through its metabolism, and a longhouse might contain 6 or 8 cows plus goats and sheep. Together, these animals could raise the interior temperature by several crucial degrees, but they also presented challenges, managing waste, controlling odors, preventing disease transmission, that the Norse clearly solved, though the exact methods remain partially obscure. But even accounting for all these known factors, some archaeological sites suggest better thermal performance than we can fully explain. There are hints in the evidence of techniques we haven't quite decoded, of knowledge that died with its practitioners. Some longhouses show traces of charcoal layers beneath wooden floors, carefully placed in patterns that don't quite make sense to modern observers. One theory suggests these might have been part of a primitive underfloor heating system where heat from the central hearth somehow radiated through channels beneath the living space. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. There are gaps in the floor construction that might have been air channels or might have served some other purpose entirely. There are stone arrangements that seem deliberate, but whose function remains opaque. Some stones are positioned at angles that appear intentional, yet serve no obvious structural purpose, leading to speculation about thermal reflection or airflow management. At one excavation site in Greenland, archaeologists found what appeared to be a secondary hearth system, smaller fire pits positioned at the far ends of the longhouse, away from the main central hearth. These would have required extra fuel, which seems wasteful, yet they were clearly used regularly. Why would a household burn additional fires when fuel was so precious? One possibility is that the main hearth, despite its size, couldn't adequately heat the building's extremities, so supplementary heating was necessary. But another possibility is more intriguing, that these secondary fires were part of a more sophisticated heating strategy we don't fully understand. Perhaps they created convection currents that improved overall circulation, or perhaps they provided localized heat for specific activities that required temperatures higher than general living areas. Some researchers have proposed that the Norse used convection currents deliberately, creating air circulation patterns within the longhouse that distributed heat more evenly. The smoke vents might have been adjustable, allowing occupants to fine-tune airflow depending on wind direction and intensity outside. There are also mysteries surrounding insulation materials. We know the Norse used wool, fur, moss, and turf, but the specific combinations and layering patterns may have been more sophisticated than we realize. Some wall sections show evidence of multiple distinct layers, each apparently serving a different function. The innermost layer might have been chosen for its moisture resistance, preventing condensation from forming on walls. The middle layers would provide insulation. The outer layers would bear the structural load and resist wind. This kind of engineered complexity suggests deep understanding of material properties. It implies experimentation, observation, and the accumulation of knowledge about how different materials behaved under various conditions of temperature, moisture, and mechanical stress. Birch bark appears frequently in Norse construction, used in ways that aren't always obvious. It's waterproof and somewhat flexible, and it may have served as a vapor barrier, preventing moisture from the interior moving into the insulation layers where it could freeze and reduce effectiveness. Archaeological evidence also reveals that different longhouses had different construction details, suggesting that builders experimented, adapted techniques to local conditions, or possessed specialized knowledge that varied from household to household. There wasn't one universal design, but rather a family of related approaches. Some of this variation might reflect different microclimates. A longhouse built in a sheltered valley could use different strategies than one exposed on a windswept coast. A building on permafrost required different foundations than one on drained ground. The Norse clearly observed their local conditions carefully and adapted their building methods accordingly, demonstrating environmental awareness that modern builders might envy. But some variation seems to reflect individual builder expertise. Certain structures show sophistication beyond what we'd expect, clever solutions to thermal problems that suggest their builders had deep intuitive understanding of heat transfer, even without modern scientific vocabulary. We must remember that the Norse didn't have thermometers or precise measurements. Their knowledge was empirical, passed down through generations, tested and refined through winters that killed mistakes. A builder learned from their parents, who learned from their parents, in a chain of experience stretching back centuries. This oral tradition of technical knowledge was robust enough to maintain complex building practices across vast distances and through significant time periods. This kind of knowledge is difficult to reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone. We can see what they built, but we can't always understand why they made specific choices, what problems they were solving, what alternatives they considered and rejected. There are hints, too, that Norse thermal management extended beyond the buildings themselves to the organization of the settlement. Houses were positioned relative to each other in patterns that seemed deliberate, perhaps to create windbreaks, perhaps to allow shared access to resources, perhaps according to principles we haven't identified. Some settlements show evidence of communal structures that might have served as shared workshops or gathering spaces. These buildings often have unusually large hearths, suggesting they provided warmth for activities that required more heat than individual households could easily generate. One particularly intriguing mystery involves seal oil lamps. We know the Norse used them, but the archaeological evidence of their placement within longhouses is puzzling. They appear in locations that seem too far from the central living areas to provide useful light or heat, yet they were clearly maintained and used regularly. The sooty residue on walls and ceilings marks their positions with certainty, but the logic of those positions remains elusive. One theory suggests these lamps served multiple purposes, not just light and heat, but also as humidity regulators. Burning seal oil produces water vapor, which in the dry Arctic air would help prevent the extreme desiccation that makes cold more difficult to bear. Proper humidity levels would also help preserve stored food and keep textiles from becoming brittle. A longhouse too dry becomes uncomfortable, causing respiratory problems and cracking lips, while one too humid risks condensation and ice formation on interior surfaces. Another mystery surrounds the treatment of hearthstones. Chemical analysis shows that some stones were repeatedly treated with what appears to be animal fat or oil. This wasn't accidental. The application was too consistent, too deliberate. But why would anyone waste valuable fat on stones? One possibility is that treating stones with fat improved their thermal properties, helping them absorb and radiate heat more effectively. Another is that it prevented certain types of stone from cracking under thermal stress. Or perhaps it served some purpose related to smoke management or air quality that we haven't considered. Some researchers speculate that the fat created a surface that helped reflect radiant heat back into the living space rather than absorbing it into the stone mass. The Norse also seem to understand something about thermal mass that modern builders sometimes forget. Heavy materials that absorb heat slowly and release it slowly can moderate temperature swings, making spaces more comfortable even as the fire burns down overnight. Some longhouse designs incorporated large stones or packed earth features that served no obvious structural purpose but would have functioned as thermal batteries. During the day, when the fire was built up for cooking and work, these masses would absorb excess heat. At night, they would release it slowly, maintaining warmer temperatures with less fuel. This principle, storing heat in mass rather than trying to heat air directly, is fundamental to passive heating design, yet the Norse employed it without formal engineering training. There's also the question of how the Norse dealt with moisture. Cold air holds less moisture than warm air, but humans and animals constantly generate water vapor through breathing and perspiration. In a tightly sealed space, this moisture can condense on cold surfaces, creating problems with ice formation and material decay. A longhouse might contain 10 or 15 people plus numerous animals, all exhaling moisture continuously throughout the long Arctic night. The Norse must have understood this problem and developed solutions, but the evidence is subtle and easily missed. Some wall constructions show features that might have been condensation channels, allowing moisture to drain away from critical areas. Some ventilation systems seem designed not just to remove smoke, but to manage humidity levels. The balance would have been delicate. Too much ventilation wastes heat, too little allows moisture buildup and air quality deterioration. Archaeological excavations sometimes reveal strange small features, carefully placed stones, unusual clay formations, deliberately packed earth, whose purposes aren't immediately clear. These might be structural elements, or they might be parts of the thermal management system, or they might serve entirely different functions we haven't imagined. This uncertainty is frustrating but also fascinating. It reminds us that the people who built these structures possessed genuine expertise, developed over centuries, refined through harsh testing. They weren't primitive or unsophisticated, they were masters of their environment in ways we're still trying to fully comprehend. Our modern education and technology give us certain advantages, but they've also caused us to lose practical knowledge that our ancestors considered essential. Consider the challenge of maintaining fire through an Arctic night that might last 6 months. You can't let the fire die completely because relighting it would be extremely difficult and would require fuel you might not have. But you also can't burn continuously at high intensity because you'd exhaust your fuel stores. The solution requires understanding fire management at a deep level, knowing exactly how to bank coals, how to position fuel for slow burning, how to regulate airflow to control combustion rate. This is sophisticated knowledge requiring both theoretical understanding and practical skill. A person skilled in fire management could judge by sound, smell, and the quality of smoke exactly what the fire needed: more air, different fuel, repositioning of coals, making adjustments that kept the fire alive without wasting resources. Modern attempts to replicate Norse heating systems have had mixed success. Experimental archaeology projects have built reconstructed longhouses using traditional techniques, but often the results don't match the thermal performance suggested by the archaeological evidence. Something is missing from our understanding. Perhaps it's in the precise angles of vents, or the specific density of turf walls, or techniques for managing fires that require years of daily practice to master. Part of the problem is that many small details don't preserve in the archaeological record. Organic materials decay, leaving only subtle traces. Techniques that involve temporary structures or portable elements leave little evidence. Knowledge that was never written down is simply lost, disappeared with the last person who knew it and failed to find a student to teach. We can imagine a Norse household where the matriarch possesses detailed knowledge about fire management, when to add what kind of fuel, how to read smoke to adjust ventilation, how to position people and activities to maximize comfort with minimum fuel use. This knowledge would have been enormously valuable but might leave almost no archaeological trace. The seasonal rhythm of fuel gathering would also have been crucial. During the brief summer, households would work frantically to accumulate driftwood, peat, dried dung, and any other combustible materials. The quality of this gathering, finding the best fuel, drying it properly, storing it correctly, would determine winter survival. A household that gathered carelessly or failed to dry fuel adequately would face a desperate winter, while one that prepared wisely would have relative comfort. Some researchers have suggested that Norse communities might have had specialists, individuals with particular expertise in construction, fire management, or thermal efficiency. These people might have advised others, helped design buildings, or supervised critical aspects of household management. But this is speculation. The sagas rarely mention such practical expertise, preferring to focus on warriors and explorers. The real heroes of Arctic survival, the people who kept everyone else alive through knowledge and skill, remain largely anonymous. Their achievements were too ordinary, too domestic, to warrant mention in tales of adventure and conflict, yet without them, no adventures would have been possible. There are also mysteries surrounding how the Norse adapted their techniques over time. Climate varied from year to year and century to century. A household strategy that worked in a mild decade might prove inadequate in a harsh one. How did communities share knowledge about adaptations and innovations? And who decided which new techniques were worth adopting versus which were dangerous experiments? We know that Norse society valued storytelling and oral tradition, but most of what survived into written sagas focuses on dramatic events, feuds, voyages, battles. The quiet accumulation and transmission of practical knowledge rarely made it into these texts, yet it was arguably more important to survival. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows that longhouse designs changed over time, with later phases incorporating features absent in earlier construction. This suggests experimentation, learning, and adaptation, a dynamic tradition rather than a static one. Some changes might reflect response to climate shifts. The medieval warm period, during which Norse expansion to Greenland occurred, eventually gave way to cooler conditions. Households would have needed to adapt their heating strategies as winters grew longer and harsher. The techniques that worked during relatively mild periods would have proven inadequate as conditions deteriorated, forcing innovation or the revival of older, more robust methods. Other changes might represent genuine innovations, someone discovering a better way to construct a hearth, a more efficient pattern for ventilation, or an improved insulation technique. If successful, these innovations would spread through the community, becoming part of the shared knowledge base. But without written records of these processes, we're left with incomplete archaeological evidence and informed speculation. We can see that Norse Arctic settlements succeeded for centuries, that they maintained warmth effectively enough to support viable communities in extreme conditions. We can identify many of their techniques, but the full picture remains frustratingly just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to emerge into consciousness. This incompleteness has its own strange beauty. The mystery invites us to imagine ourselves into their experience, to think through the problems they faced, to appreciate solutions we can only partially reconstruct. It humbles us, reminding us that ancient peoples possessed genuine expertise we shouldn't condescend to. Our modern comfort and technology sometimes blind us to the remarkable achievements of those who survived without them. When you visit a Norse archaeological site today, standing among the low mounds that mark ancient longhouses, you can still sense something of their achievement. The ruins are subtle, easily overlooked, but they represent extraordinary adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments. Close your eyes, imagine the wind that blows now blew then, even colder. Imagine snow piling against turf walls, darkness lasting months, cold that never releases its grip. Then imagine families surviving, even thriving, children growing up healthy, elders living to old age, communities maintaining themselves generation after generation. The achievement becomes staggering when you consider not just the physical challenges, but the psychological ones, maintaining hope and social cohesion through months of darkness and cold. The mystery of how they stayed so warm is really a mystery of human ingenuity, of knowledge refined through countless cold nights, of small innovations accumulated over centuries. It's a reminder that survival requires not just strength or courage, but careful observation, precise technique, and deep understanding. The stones they laid remain, their hearths still marked by ash and fire-cracked rock. The air channels they cut, the vents they positioned, the walls they built, all still visible to those who know how to look. But the warmth itself, the knowledge that created it, the hands that tended those fires through long Arctic nights, these have faded into quiet mystery. The ghosts of those fires still haunt the ruins if we're sensitive enough to feel them. Consider the moment when a Norse builder first understood that burying a house deeper into the hillside would make it warmer. This wasn't abstract knowledge from books, but hard-won understanding from experience, perhaps from observing that caves stayed warmer than surface shelters, or from noticing that snow-covered structures retained heat better than exposed ones. Someone made that connection, tested it, refined it, and passed it on. That chain of learning represents human intelligence at its most practical and essential. Or consider the person who first realized that certain rocks, when heated, held warmth longer than others. They would have noticed this through repetition, tending fires night after night, observing which hearthstones needed replacement most frequently, which radiated heat most effectively. This observation would lead to deliberate selection, seeking out the best stones for hearth construction, even if it meant traveling significant distances. Such practical geology, learned through touch and observation rather than formal study, proved invaluable for survival. The integration of livestock into living spaces demonstrates another level of sophisticated understanding. The Norse recognized that animals provided more than just food. They were living furnaces, converting fodder into body heat that warmed the entire structure. But this integration required careful management. Animals needed feeding, their waste needed removal, their health needed monitoring, and their placement within the longhouse needed optimization to maximize heat benefit while minimizing problems. Some archaeological sites show that animal areas were positioned along exterior walls, creating a thermal buffer between the cold, outside, and the human living space. The animals themselves became insulation, their bodies blocking cold drafts while their metabolic heat warmed the air. This arrangement also meant that the coldest parts of the longhouse, the areas furthest from the central hearth, were occupied by creatures with thick wool or fur rather than more vulnerable humans. The spatial organization of the longhouse was thus a three-dimensional puzzle solved through experience and transmitted through teaching. The question of fuel types adds another layer to the mystery. Different materials burn with different characteristics. Driftwood versus peat versus dried dung versus whale blubber. Each produces different heat output, different burn rates, different smoke qualities. The Norse must have understood these properties intimately, knowing which fuel to use for which purpose. Driftwood might be precious, reserved for times when high heat was needed for cooking or smithing work, while peat could provide steady, long-lasting warmth for overnight fires. Some archaeological evidence suggests that fuel was sometimes mixed deliberately, combining materials with complementary properties. Peat mixed with dried moss might burn more cleanly than peat alone, while adding small amounts of animal fat to wood fires could increase heat output. These recipes, if we can call them that, would have been part of household knowledge, tested and refined through practical experience. A family that managed fuel well could stretch limited supplies through the winter, while poor management could lead to crisis. The role of women in maintaining warmth deserves particular attention, though the archaeological record often obscures their specific contributions. In Norse society, managing the household fire was typically women's work, not because it was trivial, but because it was crucial. The person who tended the hearth controlled the household's survival. They decided when to build up the fire, when to bank it, how to arrange cooking activities to maximize efficiency, how to manage smoke and ventilation. This was skilled labor requiring constant attention and deep knowledge. A woman skilled in fire management was as valuable to her household as a man skilled in hunting or farming, perhaps more so during the dark months when hunting was impossible and fields lay frozen. Yet their expertise leaves few traces. We can see the hearths they tended, but not the thousands of small decisions they made, the adjustments to airflow, the precise timing of fuel addition, the reading of smoke that told them when to open or close vents. The social dimension of warmth also matters. A longhouse wasn't just a physical structure, but a social one, where multiple families might share space and resources. Managing communal living in such tight quarters required social technology as sophisticated as the thermal technology. Who slept where, who sat nearest the fire, how to share limited warmth fairly. These questions had to be answered not just once, but continuously as circumstances changed. Some archaeological evidence suggests that longhouses had distinct zones, areas designated for different activities or different social groups. The warmest spots nearest the central hearth might have been occupied by elders or young children, the most vulnerable to cold. Stronger adults might have slept in cooler areas, sacrificing comfort for the welfare of those who needed warmth most. This social arrangement of the thermal environment demonstrates how survival in extreme conditions required not just technical knowledge but also social cooperation and shared values. The mystery extends to seasonal transitions as well. How did households manage the shift from winter heating to summer cooling and back again? Arctic summers can be surprisingly warm, and a longhouse designed for winter insulation could become uncomfortably hot. The Norse must have had strategies for increasing ventilation during summer, perhaps by opening sections of wall or roof that remained sealed in winter. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows movable elements in longhouse construction, panels that could be shifted, openings that could be covered or uncovered. These features suggest adaptive architecture, buildings that could be reconfigured for different conditions rather than remaining static throughout the year. The transition periods, spring and fall, would have required particularly careful management. A fire that was essential one week might become unnecessary the next as weather shifted, but extinguishing it prematurely could lead to misery if cold returned. The Norse must have developed sensitivity to weather patterns, reading signs in sky and wind that told them when to reduce heating and when to intensify it. This meteorological knowledge, combined with thermal management skills, formed an integrated understanding of environment and shelter. There are hints, too, that the Norse understood something about wind patterns around buildings. Some longhouses are positioned in ways that seem calculated to reduce wind exposure, tucked into landscape features that provide natural windbreaks. Others show evidence of constructed wind barriers, walls or berms that diverted prevailing winds away from entrances or vulnerable areas of the structure. Wind is a major factor in heat loss, and managing it effectively would have been crucial for thermal efficiency. The mystery of door design also intrigues archaeologists. Norse longhouse doors were typically small and positioned carefully, sometimes with multiple doorways separated by interior walls, creating airlocks. This arrangement prevented cold air from rushing directly into living areas when doors opened. The principle is similar to modern building entry design, but the Norse developed it through practical necessity rather than theoretical understanding of heat transfer. Some sites show evidence of thick door coverings, heavy wool or fur curtains that provided additional insulation when doors were closed. These would have been essential during deep winter, when even brief door openings could cause uncomfortable temperature drops. The fact that such coverings leave minimal archaeological trace means we're probably missing other similar elements, hangings, screens, or temporary partitions that helped manage temperature zones within the longhouse but decayed completely over centuries. Window design presents another mystery. Norse longhouses typically had few or no windows, which makes sense for insulation but creates problems with interior darkness. How did they balance the need for light with the need for warmth? Some evidence suggests that they used translucent materials, thin stretched gut or bladder that allowed some light through while providing better insulation than open holes. But the details are unclear, and it's possible that during the darkest months they simply accepted living in dimness, illuminated only by hearth fire and oil lamps. This would have created an interior environment very different from what we're used to, darker, smokier, more intimate and enclosed. The psychological aspect of living in such conditions deserves consideration. Modern people, accustomed to electric lighting and precise temperature control, might find a Norse longhouse claustrophobic or oppressive. But for people raised in that environment, it might have felt cozy and secure, a protected space where family gathered, where work continued even in darkness, where life persisted despite the hostile world outside. Context shapes perception, and what seems like hardship to us might have seemed normal, even comforting, to them. The mystery of how they stayed warm is ultimately a question about the relationship between humans and environment. The Norse didn't conquer the Arctic through force, but through adaptation, developing a suite of techniques that allowed them to live in balance with extreme conditions. Their success wasn't permanent. The Greenland settlements eventually failed, probably due to multiple factors including climate change, economic shifts, and social challenges. But they succeeded for centuries, which is remarkable given the harshness of their environment. What we can learn from their thermal management goes beyond historical curiosity. Modern builders interested in sustainable architecture sometimes look to traditional techniques for inspiration, recognizing that solutions developed through centuries of trial and error often possess elegance that modern engineering struggles to match. The Norse use of thermal mass, natural insulation, passive air circulation, and integration with landscape offers lessons relevant to contemporary challenges of energy efficiency and climate adaptation. We have advantages they lacked: precise measurements, advanced materials, computer modeling, but they had advantages we often lack: deep empirical knowledge, multi-generational testing, and the humility that comes from recognizing that mistakes could be fatal. Standing in the ruins of a Norse longhouse, feeling the wind that still blows across those Arctic landscapes, one experiences a peculiar temporal vertigo. The physical space remains largely unchanged, but the human knowledge that animated it has largely vanished. The stones remember nothing, the turf walls tell no stories, the hearths are cold and dark. Yet something persists, a sense of presence, of human ingenuity and endurance, of problems solved and knowledge passed down through generations. The mystery of their warmth is preserved in absence, in the gap between what the ruins show us and what they cannot tell us. It's preserved in the questions that arise when we try to understand how mere humans, without modern technology, not only survived, but created viable communities in one of Earth's least forgiving environments. The archaeological record gives us fragments, a hearthstone here, a wall section there, traces of organic materials, patterns in post holes and stone arrangements. From these fragments we construct hypotheses, build computer models, conduct experiments with reconstructed structures. Sometimes our reconstructions work well, confirming that we've understood something correctly. Sometimes they fail mysteriously, performing worse than the archaeological evidence suggests the originals did, telling us that we're still missing something important. These failures are valuable because they humble us, reminding us that our ancestors weren't simple or ignorant. They were intelligent, observant, and capable of solving complex problems through methods different from but no less valid than our own. The mystery invites us to keep looking, keep questioning, keep trying to understand. Perhaps someday someone will notice a detail that previous archaeologists missed, or conduct an experiment that reveals a technique we hadn't considered. Perhaps climate scientists will provide new information about historical conditions that helps us understand thermal challenges more precisely. Perhaps traditional knowledge from other cold climate cultures will offer insights applicable to understanding Norse practices. Or perhaps some mysteries will remain forever unsolved, the knowledge truly lost, irretrievable across the centuries that separate us from those cold Arctic nights. This possibility is melancholy, but also strangely appropriate. Not everything can or should be recovered. Some things belong to their time, valued by those who needed them, lost when that need passed. The warmth the Norse created is gone, dissipated into the Arctic air centuries ago, but the fact that they created it remains preserved in archaeological evidence and in the questions we still ask. How did they stay so warm? The question echoes across time, asked by each generation of archaeologists who examine the ruins and wonder at the achievement they represent. The answer lies somewhere in the stones and soil, in the patterns of construction and the traces of ancient fires, in techniques both ingenious and practical that allowed humans to thrive where merely surviving should have been triumph enough. The full answer remains elusive, perhaps forever, preserved in the silence of those cold northern ruins. But the searching itself has value, connecting us across centuries to people who faced fundamental challenges we now largely avoid through technology. In trying to understand their warmth, we encounter their humanity, people like us, facing fear and cold and darkness, finding solutions through observation and experimentation and courage. The mystery endures, quiet and patient, waiting among the low mounds of turf and stone that mark where longhouses once stood. The wind blows across them still, cold and indifferent, as it has for centuries. But once, those structures held warmth and light and life, sustained by knowledge we can only partially recover. That warmth is gone, but the memory of it persists, preserved in ruins and questions and the human desire to understand how our ancestors survived against such odds. Now let us consider a different experience of the same cold world, a life lived on the other side of the social divide that ran through every Norse community. While commoners crowded together in smoky halls, sharing space with animals, and enduring constant discomfort, another class experienced Arctic winter very differently. The chiefs and wealthy landowners of Norse Arctic settlements faced the same climate as everyone else, but they faced it with resources that transformed hardship into something almost bearable. Their privilege wasn't about escaping the cold, no one could do that, but about managing it with less personal suffering. Imagine entering a chief's longhouse in the same village where we began our journey. From the outside, it might not look dramatically different, still built of turf and timber, still low and earth-sheltered, still designed according to the same basic principles. But the differences reveal themselves in subtle ways. The building is larger, first of all. More internal space means better air circulation, less oppressive crowding, room for smoke to rise and dissipate before it becomes unbearable. The household can spread out, claim personal sleeping spaces, avoid the claustrophobic press of bodies that marks commoner longhouses. The walls are thicker too, with more layers of insulation. The outer turf is deeper, providing better protection from wind. Inside, the walls might be lined with wooden panels or hung with heavy textiles, creating an additional buffer between living space and cold. These panels are often carved or decorated, serving aesthetic purposes while also breaking up air currents that might otherwise carry cold directly to the inhabitants. The roof timbers are more substantial, allowing for better construction of smoke vents. These vents can be adjusted with greater precision, controlling airflow to maximize warmth while minimizing smoke accumulation. Someone of high status can afford to experiment with ventilation to maintain the fire at the optimal level for comfort rather than mere survival. They might employ someone whose specific responsibility includes monitoring the vents throughout the day, adjusting them as wind direction changes or as the fire burns hotter or cooler. The hearth itself is different, larger, constructed with better stones, carefully selected for their thermal properties. The fire pit might be lined with clay, which radiates heat more effectively than bare earth. The arrangement of stones around the hearth creates channels for airflow, improving combustion efficiency. Some elite hearths incorporate sophisticated designs passed down through generations, knowledge about which stones hold heat longest, which arrangements produce the most warmth with the least smoke. Most significantly, the elite have access to better fuel. While commoners carefully ration driftwood and supplement with peat or dried dung, the wealthy can maintain hotter fires, burning cleaner fuel. Their stores are deeper, accumulated through control of resources and labor. They might have entire outbuildings dedicated to fuel storage, keeping wood dry and properly aged for optimal burning. This better fuel means less smoke, which means clearer air, which means less eye irritation and coughing. It means higher temperatures, which means genuine comfort rather than mere survival. It means the ability to dry wet clothing quickly, to warm cold hands fully, to sleep without waking from cold. The difference between adequate fuel and abundant fuel is the difference between endurance and comfort, between surviving winter and living through it with some measure of ease. The animals kept indoors are different too. While commoners house whatever livestock they can maintain, the wealthy keep the best breeding stock, the healthiest and most productive animals. These animals are better fed, which means they generate more body heat, contributing more to the household's warmth. A well-fed cow radiates significantly more heat than a half-starved one, and the elite can afford to maintain their livestock at optimal condition throughout the winter. Elite households also have more control over how animals are positioned within the building. Instead of livestock crowding wherever they fit, they're placed strategically to maximize their contribution to heating while minimizing the inconvenience of their presence. Partitions might separate them more completely from human living spaces, reducing smell and noise. These partitions are substantial enough to block odors but permeable enough to allow heat circulation, creating zones of different temperature and air quality within the longhouse. The animals themselves might be groomed more regularly, kept cleaner, reducing the oppressive barnyard smell that pervades commoner dwellings. This attention to animal maintenance is possible because elite households have servants whose labor can be directed toward such refinements. The sleeping arrangements reveal the class divide most starkly. While commoners sleep on simple benches along the walls, covered with rough woolen blankets, the wealthy sleep on platforms raised above the floor, where warmer air accumulates. These platforms might be covered with furs, seal, bear, fox, providing insulation far superior to wool. A single bear skin has the warming capacity of several wool blankets, and the elite might layer multiple furs for exceptional warmth. Some elite sleeping spaces are curtained off, creating small private rooms within the larger hall. These enclosures trap warmth, creating microclimates several degrees warmer than the communal space. A chief might sleep in genuine comfort while their servants shiver on open benches. The psychological impact of this arrangement is profound. Everyone in the household knows exactly who sleeps warm and who sleeps cold, who has privacy and who has none. The curtains themselves represent significant investment, requiring substantial quantities of fabric or carefully prepared leather. Their maintenance, keeping them clean, repairing damage, replacing them as they wear, requires ongoing resources that only wealthy households can afford. The wealthy also have access to specialized heating tools that commoners can't afford. Seal oil lamps, which require constant fuel and maintenance, might burn throughout the night in elite quarters. These provide both light and heat, transforming dark winter evenings into something almost pleasant. The soft glow of seal oil lamps allows for activities after dark, conversation, gaming, craftwork, that would be impossible in the near-total darkness of commoner dwellings. Some households possess soapstone bed warmers, carved stones heated by the fire, and then placed under blankets to warm sleeping spaces before bed. This luxury, requiring both the specialized stone and the fuel to heat it, puts sleep itself on a different level of comfort. The ritual of warming the bed becomes part of elite evening routine, a small ceremony of comfort that marks the transition from waking to sleeping. Servants might heat several stones in rotation, ensuring that elite family members slip into beds that are genuinely warm rather than merely less cold than the surrounding air. The elite wear better clothing too, and more of it. They can afford multiple layers of fine wool, garments specifically tailored for indoor versus outdoor use. They own enough clothing to rotate items, allowing wet or soiled garments to dry and air out while wearing clean alternatives. This seems like a minor advantage until you consider the cumulative effect of always having dry, clean clothing versus wearing the same damp, dirty garments day after day. Their outer garments might include imported furs or specially prepared leather that blocks wind more effectively. They possess separate boots for different conditions, allowing them to always have dry footwear available. These seem like small advantages, but over the course of a long winter, they accumulate into significant difference in daily comfort. The person with dry boots and warm socks experiences the world differently than the person whose feet are perpetually cold and damp. The quality of clothing construction matters too. Elite garments are made by skilled craftspeople who have time to work carefully, creating seams that don't leak wind and hems that don't unravel under stress. Commoner clothing, often made hastily by people exhausted from other labor, wears out faster and performs more poorly. The elite can afford repairs and replacements. Commoners must make do with increasingly inadequate garments as winter progresses. Undergarments represent another invisible privilege. The elite wear multiple layers beneath their outer clothing, creating insulating air pockets that trap body heat. Commoners might have only a single layer between skin and outer garment, making them far more vulnerable to cold. These hidden layers of privilege are literally unseen by others, but profoundly felt by those who wear them. Food quality differs dramatically. While commoners subsist on rationed porridge and preserved fish, the wealthy eat richer meals with more variety. They control the best hunting territories, have first claim on fresh meat, and maintain larger stores of diverse foods. When a seal is caught in winter, the chief's household gets the blubber and choice cuts, while commoners receive the lean meat and scraps. Their diet includes more fat, which is crucial for maintaining body heat. They eat butter, seal blubber, and the fattiest cuts of meat regularly, while commoners might see such foods rarely. This nutritional advantage translates directly into better cold tolerance, more energy, greater resistance to winter illness. The body burning adequate fat generates more internal heat, making the external cold less penetrating. The elite also consume more protein, supporting better muscle mass and overall health. They have access to imported goods, dried fruits, nuts, honey, that provide variety and additional nutrients. These dietary advantages compound over the course of winter. By midwinter, the nutritional gap between elite and commoner is visible in body condition, energy levels, and resistance to disease. The elite can also afford to maintain higher indoor temperatures during meal preparation, making cooking a more comfortable activity. Their hearths are large enough to support multiple cooking vessels simultaneously, allowing more elaborate food preparation than commoners can manage. The women who oversee cooking in elite households work in relative comfort, able to take time with food preparation to create meals that are not just nutritious but enjoyable. This transforms eating from pure necessity into a source of daily pleasure. The elite household might employ someone whose primary responsibility is cooking, freeing them from other labor to focus on meal quality. This specialization produces better food and allows for the development of culinary skill across generations. Winter feasts hosted by wealthy households serve social and political functions but also represent displays of resource control. A chief who can afford to feed dozens of people hot, rich food in a warm hall demonstrates their success at resource management in a way everyone understands. These feasts provide temporary relief for guests from the grinding discomfort of their own households. For a few hours, they experience the warmth and abundance that the elite enjoy daily. This taste of comfort reinforces the social hierarchy. Everyone knows what they're missing and who controls it. The feast serves as both gift and reminder, generosity and demonstration of power combined. The psychological impact of returning to their own cold, dark, hungry households after such feasting cannot be overstated. Commoners experience their own conditions more acutely after tasting elite comfort, yet they also feel gratitude for the temporary respite and obligation to the host who provided it. The wealthy also possess leisure time that commoners lack. With servants and dependents to perform basic maintenance tasks, elite individuals can spend their days in relative comfort rather than in constant labor. They can sit close to the fire, engage in conversation or gaming, pursue crafts or intellectual activities. This leisure is not mere indulgence but a form of cultural capital, allowing time for the development of skills and knowledge that reinforce status. This leisure time is actually important for survival in its own way. Constant exposure to stress and discomfort weakens the body and mind over time. The ability to rest, to recover, to exist without constant low-level suffering makes people more resilient, less susceptible to illness, more capable of clear thinking. Elite individuals enter spring less depleted, better able to engage with the intense labor demands of the growing season. Elite leisure includes activities that would be impossible in commoner households. They might play board games imported from distant lands, listen to traveling poets recite sagas, practice intricate crafts like fine carving or weaving. These activities serve multiple purposes. They pass time, they demonstrate cultural refinement, they create objects and knowledge that further distinguish elite from common. The chief, who can recite lengthy genealogies or discuss fine points of law, possesses cultural capital unavailable to those who spend their time on survival labor. The social dynamics within elite households differ from those in commoner dwellings. With more space and resources, there's less friction, fewer conflicts over minor issues. People can separate when tensions rise, claim personal space when they need solitude. This makes the winter psychologically easier to endure, reducing the grinding stress of forced proximity that wears down commoners. Elite children grow up learning different skills and expectations than commoner children. They're trained for leadership, taught to read social situations, educated in law and custom. Their winter experience includes education as well as survival, preparation for future authority alongside present comfort. This intergenerational transmission of privilege ensures that class distinctions persist across time. But elite status brings its own burdens, often invisible to those below. A chief is responsible for the survival of everyone dependent on their household, not just immediate family, but servants, tenants, and others who look to them for protection and resources. The decisions they make about resource allocation carry life and death weight. Misjudge the length of winter, ration too loosely, and people might starve before spring. Ration too strictly, and people suffer unnecessarily while resources sit unused. This responsibility creates psychological pressure that comfort can't fully relieve, a weight that presses down even in the warmest hall. The chief must balance competing demands constantly, enough fuel to maintain comfort, but enough reserve for emergency, enough food for daily needs, but enough stored for unexpected winter extension. These calculations require knowledge, judgment, and the willingness to bear the consequences of error. Elite individuals must also maintain their status through constant demonstration of competence and generosity. A chief who hoards resources while dependents suffer loses legitimacy and might face challenges to their authority. They must walk a careful line between self-preservation and communal obligation. The winter feast that seems like pure display is actually necessary political work, demonstrating both abundance and willingness to share. Winter brings political dimensions too. The enforced proximity of winter settlement means that social conflicts can't be deferred or avoided. A chief must manage disputes, enforce decisions, maintain order among people who are confined together for months and growing increasingly irritable. The skills required for this management, patience, judgment, authority, are constantly tested throughout the dark months. Minor disputes that could be ignored in summer become significant when people cannot escape each other. The chief must mediate arguments over sleeping space, food distribution, noise, personal affronts. Each decision affects their legitimacy and authority. Favor one party, too obviously, and accusations of bias erode trust. Try to satisfy everyone, and decisive leadership seems weak. The elite also face expectations about hospitality. Their households must be open to visitors, even in deep winter when any additional person means increased resource consumption. Refusing hospitality damages reputation, but excessive generosity threatens household survival. Every decision about opening their warm hall to others involves calculation, balancing social obligation against material reality. The arrival of unexpected visitors in midwinter creates particular tension. Social norms demand welcome, but elite households must assess whether they can afford the additional burden. Travelers might bring valuable information or important social connections, justifying their consumption. Or they might simply represent mouths to feed at the worst possible time. There's also the isolation of authority. A chief can't complain about the cold to their dependents without appearing weak. They can't admit fear about winter supplies or express doubt about their decisions. They must project confidence and competence regardless of their private uncertainties, maintaining a facade that itself requires energy. This emotional labor of leadership has no respite during winter. The chief cannot have a bad day, cannot show weakness, cannot seek comfort from those below them in the hierarchy. Their only confidants might be a spouse or a few trusted advisors, but even these relationships are constrained by the need to maintain authority. True vulnerability is impossible for those who hold power. This means that even in their warm, comfortable halls, the elite experience a kind of cold that commoners don't. The cold of responsibility, of leadership without support, of making decisions alone that affect everyone. Their bodies might be warmer, but their minds carry burdens that generate their own form of suffering. The insomnia that afflicts many leaders in winter has nothing to do with physical cold. It comes from reviewing resource calculations, worrying about stores running short, considering political implications of every small decision made during the day. The contrast between elite and common experience creates interesting social dynamics. Commoners know exactly how the wealthy live and can see the unfairness directly. The person sleeping on a fur-covered platform in a private chamber literally looks down on the person huddled under rough wool on a wall bench. This physical arrangement makes hierarchy visible and unavoidable every single day and night of winter. Yet this inequality is generally accepted, even legitimized. The social structure is understood to be necessary. Chiefs provide organization, protection, access to resources. Their comfort is seen as appropriate compensation for their responsibilities. Challenges to the hierarchy are rare, not because people are happy with their position, but because alternatives seem worse, because the coordination provided by elite leadership has demonstrable survival value. The ideology supporting this inequality is subtle and pervasive. Stories and traditions emphasize the natural fitness of certain families for leadership, the special qualities that distinguish them from common people. Elite children are taught they have special obligations that justify special privileges. Commoner children are taught that hierarchy reflects the natural order, that their place in it carries its own form of honor. Some elite individuals take their responsibilities seriously, genuinely trying to balance personal comfort against communal welfare. They see their privilege not as pure advantage, but as resource to be deployed for household benefit. They maintain warm halls partly so they can offer temporary refuge to others when needed. When a commoner family faces crisis, illness, fire, food shortage, these responsible chiefs provide assistance that might mean the difference between survival and death. Other elites are more exploitative, extracting maximum advantage from their position while providing minimum support to dependents. These individuals justify their privilege through ideology, claims about natural hierarchy, superior bloodlines, divine favor. They view their comfort as simple entitlement rather than compensation for responsibility. These chiefs maintain the warm halls and full stores not for communal benefit, but for personal satisfaction. The archaeological record sometimes reveals these differences. Some elite longhouses show evidence of generous hospitality, large quantities of food consumed, many people accommodated, resources distributed widely. Others show hoarding, minimal sharing, resource concentration in the hands of a few. The physical remains of feasting versus the absence of such remains tells us something about the character of those who once lived in these spaces. The distribution of imported goods provides another indicator. Some elite graves contain luxury items but also show signs that similar items circulated more widely in the community. Other elite graves hoard imported goods that never reached anyone else. These patterns suggest different philosophies of leadership and different relationships between elite and common within specific settlements. The life experience of elite children provides another window into privilege. While common children work from young ages, contributing essential labor to household survival, elite children have time for education, training, and play. They grow up warmer, better fed, less stressed. Their childhood includes activities designed to prepare them for leadership rather than immediate survival contribution. This childhood advantage compounds over time. Better nutrition supports better physical development. Elite children grow taller, stronger, healthier than their common counterparts. Less stress allows healthier psychological development, fostering confidence and entitlement that marks them as elite even before they assume formal authority. The gap between classes is literally embodied in the physical differences between children raised in different circumstances. Access to education and training prepares elite children for future leadership roles. They learn to read situations, negotiate conflicts, make decisions that affect others. The privileges of birth are reinforced and reproduced across generations through this differential childhood experience. By the time they reach adulthood, elite children have accumulated advantages that make their assumption of authority seem natural and inevitable. Elite women experience a somewhat different version of privilege than elite men. They have more control over household management, more authority within their domestic sphere, better access to resources. But they're still subordinate to male family members in political and legal matters. Their power is real but circumscribed, operating within boundaries defined by patriarchal norms. An elite woman manages the hearth, controls food distribution, supervises servants, all crucial responsibilities. Her knowledge and competence directly determine household comfort and survival. Yet her authority is conditional, dependent on her relationship to men who formally hold power. A chief's wife has more authority than a commoner man in some domains, but less than her husband in all domains. The elite woman's winter experience includes both privilege and constraint. She sleeps warm, eats well, wears fine clothing, all genuine advantages. But she also bears responsibility without full authority, managing crucial household functions while deferring to male judgment in public matters. Her comfort comes with the burden of maintaining domestic order for others' benefit as much as her own. Still, elite women live far more comfortably than common women. They sleep warmer, eat better, wear finer clothing, perform less physical labor. Their suffering from cold is real, but significantly mitigated compared to the experience of women from lower social classes. The hardships of childbirth and child-rearing, universal across classes, are at least experienced in relative warmth and with better nutrition. Elite women's work differs qualitatively from that of common women. While both spin wool and weave fabric, elite women work with better materials under better conditions. Their hands are less damaged by constant cold water and harsh soap. Their posture is less degraded by repetitive physical labor in uncomfortable positions. Their bodies less worn down by the cumulative effects of privation. The social world of elite women includes relationships and activities unavailable to common women. They participate in networks of elite women from other households, exchanging gifts, information, and support. These networks operate parallel to male political relationships, sometimes influencing them, always providing elite women with resources and connections beyond their immediate households. Common women have no access to such networks and no time to maintain them if they did. As winter deepens and spring remains distant, the class divide becomes more visible and perhaps more painful for those on the wrong side of it. Commoners grow thinner, more exhausted, more susceptible to illness. The elite remain relatively healthy and strong, insulated by resources from the worst effects of prolonged cold. The gap between classes, always present, becomes a chasm as winter grinds on and accumulated advantages and disadvantages compound. This creates a strange paradox. Everyone in the community faces the same Arctic winter, the same months of cold and darkness, yet they experience it so differently that they might as well be living in different worlds. One group survives, the other lives with relative comfort. The difference is not just degree but kind. The commoner's winter is about endurance, the elite's about maintaining standards. What unites them is the cold, what divides them is everything else. The midwinter period brings these distinctions into sharpest relief. When days are shortest and cold is most intense, when food stores are depleted and fuel is running low, the cushion of elite privilege becomes most apparent. While commoners worry about whether their supplies will last until spring, the elite worry about when to begin distributing aid to those most in need. Both face winter's challenges, but from positions so different that their fundamental relationship to survival diverges. The spring thaw reveals the winter's toll most clearly. Common households emerge depleted, having consumed their resources completely, their members visibly weakened. Elite households emerge in much better condition, still possessing stores, their members healthy and ready for the intense work of the short growing season. The winter that challenged everyone tested them unequally, and the results show in body condition, energy levels, and preparedness for the coming year's labor. This differential survival rate reinforces hierarchy. Those who make it through winter in good condition are better positioned for summer success, accumulating more resources, strengthening their position for the next winter. Those who barely survive remain vulnerable, dependent, unable to improve their circumstances. The cycle perpetuates itself. Privilege enables survival, which enables further privilege, while disadvantage creates vulnerability, which creates further disadvantage. Yet the system persists because it functions after a fashion. The organization provided by elite leadership does have value: coordination of labor, mediation of disputes, distribution of emergency resources. Access to elite resources during emergencies does save lives. The inequality might be profound, but the alternative, no organization at all, seems more threatening to everyone, or at least is presented as such by those who benefit from the current arrangement. The commoner who contemplates challenging the system must consider practical realities. Who would organize communal labor? Who would mediate disputes? How would resources be distributed fairly without recognized authority? The elite's advantage isn't just material, but also organizational. They possess knowledge, experience, and social capital that gives them genuine leverage in maintaining their position. As we consider this elite experience of Arctic winter, we might notice our own discomfort with the inequality, our modern sense that such privilege is unjust. But we should also recognize the way that context shapes what seems natural or necessary. In a world where survival is precarious, where coordination is essential, where resources are desperately scarce, inequality might emerge almost inevitably. The question is not whether hierarchy exists, but how it operates and whom it serves. The chiefs sleep warm while their dependents shiver, and everyone knows it, and somehow the community endures. This is neither a moral vindication nor a simple condemnation of the system. It's simply how these particular people organize themselves to survive in this particular place. The moral complexity resists easy judgment. These are not monsters exploiting innocence, but neither are they merely competent managers compensated fairly for their services. The warm beds, the full bellies, the comfortable halls, these weren't accidental luxuries, but deliberate constructions of privilege, maintained through control of resources and labor. The suffering of commoners wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but a necessary condition for elite comfort. The resources that kept elite halls warm came from somewhere, extracted from land and sea by someone's labor. The choice to direct those resources toward elite comfort rather than broader distribution was a political choice, not a natural necessity. Yet the chiefs and wealthy landowners would insist they earned their position through competence, through better management, through taking on responsibilities that others couldn't or wouldn't shoulder. They'd point to their role in organizing survival, mediating conflicts, coordinating labor, and distributing resources. They'd note that their comfort isn't pure luxury, but enables them to fulfill their leadership functions. A chief weakened by cold and hunger cannot effectively manage a household. Their comfort is thus investment in communal survival, not mere self-indulgence. Both perspectives contain truth. The elite did provide valuable functions, and they also exploited their position for personal advantage. The commoners did bear unfair burdens, and they also benefited from organization they might not have achieved independently. Winter in the Arctic permitted no simple moral calculations. The archaeological evidence we have from these settlements shows us the material reality of inequality, but cannot fully recover the lived experience on either side of the divide. We see the large halls and the small ones, the elaborate graves and the simple ones. We see the imported luxury goods concentrated in elite contexts, but we cannot fully know what it felt like to sleep cold while knowing others slept warm, or what it felt like to sleep warm while knowing others suffered. The settlements themselves, when excavated, reveal careful planning and substantial investment. The elite longhouses show evidence of skilled construction, of resources devoted not just to function, but to comfort and display. The positioning of these buildings within settlements often shows deliberate choice, the best drainage, the most protected locations, the most convenient access to resources. Even the landscape itself was arranged to advantage the elite. The waste middens associated with different households tell stories about diet and resource access. Elite middens contain more animal bones from choice cuts, more fish bones from prime species, more evidence of varied and abundant diet. Common middens show heavier reliance on porridge, less variety, evidence of making use of parts of animals that elite households discarded. The garbage of the past reveals the inequality of the past in ways that written records might not. As spring finally arrives and ice begins to break, the community emerges from winter, transformed by the experience. Relationships have been tested, hierarchies reinforced or occasionally challenged, and everyone has learned again what they already knew about their place in the social order. The elite emerge from their warm halls, ready to direct the summer's labor, their authority reaffirmed by their successful management of winter. The commoners emerge depleted but alive, their survival dependent on, but also testimony to their own resilience and endurance. The cycle will repeat next winter and the winter after that, each season reinforcing the patterns established by the previous ones. The inequality that winter makes so visible will persist through summer, though seasonal plenty might soften its sharpest edges. The community will prepare for the next winter with full knowledge of what awaits: the cold, the dark, the hunger for some, and relative comfort for others. This knowledge shapes everything they do in the warm months, every decision about resource allocation, every calculation about what can be afforded and what cannot. And through all of this, the land itself remains neutral. the Arctic winter falling equally on all, making no distinction between chief and commoner. The cold cares nothing for human hierarchy or human suffering or human comfort. It is we humans who create these distinctions, who decide how to organize ourselves against the cold, who determine that some will face it wrapped in furs, while others shiver under thin wool. Winter reveals our choices by making their consequences unavoidable. And so we come to the end of our quiet journey through Arctic cold, through the lived experiences of those who made homes in one of Earth's most unforgiving climates. We've walked through the daily struggles of common folk, felt the weight of endless tasks in numbing cold, understood survival as endless repetition rather than dramatic heroism. We've followed Freydís through her life of quiet competence, seeing how the skills of household management translated into leadership during exploration, how the psychological resilience developed through Arctic winters enabled her to make hard decisions when necessary. Her story reminds us that the same qualities that seem unremarkable in daily life can become extraordinary when circumstances demand. We've explored mysteries still unsolved, contemplated heating systems that work better than we fully understand, and recognized that ancient knowledge sometimes exceeds our modern ability to reconstruct it. The Norse who settled these Arctic lands possessed expertise refined through centuries, tested through harsh winters that killed mistakes, passed down through generations in forms that don't always survive in archaeological evidence. We've examined the lives of the privileged, seen how the same cold environment produced vastly different experiences depending on social position, understood that warmth itself was a form of wealth, carefully hoarded and strategically deployed. The inequality was stark, yet functional within its context, creating stable communities that persisted for generations. Looking back across everything we've considered, certain themes emerge like familiar shapes in fog. The importance of patience, of accepting discomfort without expectation of immediate relief. The value of routine, of small tasks repeated endlessly because each repetition matters. The way that survival in extreme conditions depends less on individual strength than on collective knowledge and mutual support. The Norse Arctic settlements teach us something about human adaptability, about our species' remarkable capacity to make homes in places that seem designed to kill us. They didn't conquer the Arctic or defeat the cold. They accommodated themselves to it, learned its rhythms, developed techniques for living within constraints that seemed impossibly narrow. Their success wasn't glamorous. No one won glory for managing a hearth efficiently, for rationing food carefully, for maintaining turf walls against wind and weather. Yet these unglamorous tasks, performed with skill and consistency over decades and centuries, represent genuine human triumph. As you lie here now, in whatever comfortable place you've found, consider the contrast between your circumstances and theirs. The reliable warmth surrounding you, the abundance of food requiring no careful rationing, the freedom from constant maintenance work against cold, all of these represent luxuries they would have found almost incomprehensible. Your worst winter days, the times when heating systems struggle or storms disrupt utilities, represent mere inconveniences compared to their normal daily reality. The baseline of your comfort exceeds their peak experiences of warmth. Yet they endured, and more than that, they created communities, raised families, built cultures, told stories, found moments of joy and beauty, even in the midst of hardship. They were fully human, experiencing the complete range of emotion and thought, despite physical conditions we would find intolerable. Perhaps there's something valuable in contemplating their experience, in imaginatively entering a world so different from ours. Not to romanticize suffering or pretend that hardship is somehow ennobling, but simply to appreciate the extraordinary range of human experience, the diverse ways that people have found to live. Their world of cold and darkness and endless careful work has vanished. The settlements are ruins now, the longhouses collapsed into subtle mounds of earth and stone. The people who knew exactly how to keep warm in Arctic winter, who possessed that crucial knowledge in their hands and memories, have been gone for centuries. But something of their experience persists in the archaeological evidence, in the traces they left, in the patterns of their daily lives that we can partially reconstruct. And in contemplating those traces, in imagining ourselves into their cold world, we connect across vast distances of time and experience. Let that connection be a comfort now as you drift towards sleep. Think of all those people across all those winters, lying down to rest in their smoky halls, pulling wool blankets close, listening to wind and fire and breathing. They slept as you sleep now, surrendering to rest after the day's demands. Their struggles are over, their tasks complete, their long Arctic winters finally ended. The cold that dominated their lives has released them. They rest now beyond all discomfort, beyond all need, in a stillness deeper and more complete than winter darkness. And you, in your warmth and comfort, can rest too. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever supports it. Notice the temperature of the air against your skin, probably perfectly comfortable, requiring no thought or adjustment. The technology surrounding you, insulation, heating systems, weatherproof construction, all descended in some distant way from the knowledge those Arctic dwellers developed. They learned how to hold warmth close, and that knowledge, much refined and transformed, still shelters you now. So sleep well, knowing that countless generations struggled against cold so that eventually people like you could take warmth for granted. Sleep in comfort they would have called miraculous. In safety, they worked their entire lives to approximate. Let their long labor be complete in your easy rest. The wind that bothered them can't reach you. The cold they fought isn't your concern. The darkness they endured doesn't touch you. You are safe, you are warm, you are allowed to simply stop and rest. Their story is finished now, told in full, and so is our journey through their world. The Arctic night that seemed endless to them is ending for you in the gentle drift toward dreams. Let go of the effort of attention. Release your hold on wakefulness. Allow yourself to slip into sleep as easily as snow settling on silent ground. The village doesn't freeze. The fire holds through the night. The walls stand firm against the wind. And you, warm and safe in your own time, can finally rest. Good night.